honestly, being so close to it, I wasn't aware of how odd it was that so many, as you say, guys kind of grew up. My family's all from Boston. My grandparents lived in South Boston, which is very similar to Charlestown. Um, it was just known, and it didn't seem like anything interesting, never mind unique. And the older I got, the more I realized this is crazy. This is 1 square mile of the United States where more bank and armored car robbers come from than anywhere else. And that really got me interested in, why there and who might these people be. And then I remember at sort of the same time that I was formulating that, I was watching this one of these crime recreation shows that were popular at the time. And it was about a bank robbery. And these four guys burst into a bank and they wave their guns, make a lot of noise, and they like grab a teller and they get the money and they pull her out of the bank and they jump in a van and they sort of toss her to the side and drive off. I remember watching it thinking, like, what about her? Like, that's like, her life is never going to be the same. Never mind what would happen if she had gotten into that van and had been, taken away. And that really kind of lit up my switchboard too. So it was those two things. And then they kind of crossed to become, what if one of those bank robbers, in sort of casing the bank and casing the bank manager, becomes interested in the bank manager and realizes maybe I want something more than what I have. And it was, I knew that I had a really good idea for a book, but as I said, like my second book, The Blood Artists, which was fun, but it was kind of a misadventure. I was gun shy. So I held on to this for a while. I did a lot of research over time while I was working on things. And I was really hesitant to get into it. But then once I did, I had done so much work on it, it really came quickly. It's funny, since publication of Prince of Thieves, The Town, I've talked to so many bank robbers and, guys and, gangsters and this and that. Back then, before that, I was still sort of a youngish guy, and I think people were were wary. I did have a couple of tenuous contacts, but it wasn't like I could sit down and interview someone. So I had to do a lot of legwork, a lot of reading, and then I had to get. I just got lucky a number of times. I remember my mother was in the hospital for some sort of procedure, and she was a smoker, so I had to go outside to smoke. So I take her outside, we go downstairs, and while we're out in front, she's smoking. Armored truck pulls right up, and so I'm already right there. So I was able to really watch these guys in an innocent way and notice things. And there was a lot of serendipity. Things kept happening in that way because obviously, you can't call up the armored car robbery and ask them, how they do what they do. That's a huge red flag. So it was really, that's the fun part of writing, is getting out of this chair and actually trying to, hit the streets and figure things out. Even spending time in Charlestown, again, very similar to South Boston, but I had never lived there. So I really had to, spend some time in that neighborhood and just keep my eyes open. And that kind of, it's kind of fun walking around with a secret project in your head and you're just learning. It was a lot of fun to research, and I learned a lot that I've never used except in writing. I was just captivated. It was fascinating to try to figure out how someone might do this, but also there's bigger issues. Nowadays, there's so little cash being, changing hands. The book was set in the late 90s where there still was, but that's how I came to the Fenway Park aspect of it. Like, there's a place at the time was almost 100% cash, and on a big, 3-day, homestand versus the Yankees, that's a lot of money. And so I spent some time kind of prowling around Fenway Park, trying to guess where the money room is, how do they move money in and out, because that's a lot of cash. So that, there was a kind of adventurous side to it. But the more I learned, the more fascinated I was, and I figured if I'm interested, I can definitely make it interesting to readers. I always tell people who want to write, so people always say write what you know, and I say just like write the story that no one else can write, and a lot of times that's your voice, or that's your perspective or your obsessions. And I just got really fascinated with the nuts and bolts aspect of how one would go about that. In the book, in the like sort of the middle section, the middle heist is actually of a movie theater. Again, mainly a cash business back in when the book was set in the 96. It was a movie theater that I would go to quite a bit. So, I was just really sort of visualizing, what would I do? I would come here, I would park out here, I'd eat lunch here, I'd watch people going in and out. And I did a little bit of that, just to see what it was like. So it was really from Doug's perspective, all of that, trying to think, because again, the character, yeah, I'm a huge fan of the movie Heat, which had come out, and I loved it. Those guys were like high tech, right? And that was cool. So I'm like, I can't do that. I want to go a completely different way. And so, the character was very smart, but also, he had a limited number of tools at his disposal. So he really had to think, kind of ground level, how to get in, how to get it, how to get out, how to plan it so that you can, maximize your return and minimize the risk.
What about writing his crew? This is a great supporting cast here. Would you talk about them each and the original characters you invented?
Yeah, I mean, it was super important to me. I mean, one of the themes of the book, I think, is that you are your friends, and so as I was working on it, I realized that each of those other characters, the Gem, the Glowsy, and I can't think of Des, were all sort of like facets of Doug's own character. Gem was that reckless side, the one who got into fights with hockey players on his own team, who would lose control sometimes. Des was that thinker, the guy who was really devoted to his family and sort of the steady one. And then Glowsy was really a neighborhood guy, getting married and never wanting to leave and never even think about anything outside of Charlestown. They're all sort of different facets of what was going on in him, and that really worked for me in terms of telling the story through him. In a sense, it was sort of like, you remember like Saturday Night Fever, in Bay Ridge, New York, just, these guys, it was sort of like that, except instead of disco dancing, just, robbing banks and armored cars, that same sort of real, working class, proud of where they're from and no real aspirations of going anywhere else. The name Gem actually came to me. I for some reason I had this memory of maybe third grade or something. I remember there was a kid who was causing trouble in one class, and the teacher came to the door, and I must have been sitting near enough to the door so that I could hear the teacher's private conversation. And she's like, I can't handle him. You have to take this one. He's a real gem. Meaning like this kid is really that way. And it just really stuck with me. And, when I was coming up with names, I wanted to come up with something, different, distinctive, but not, crazy. So that very incident is relayed in the book in terms of how he got his nickname. The kid was always getting in trouble in class and being moved around because nobody could handle him. And he was just a great character because he was such a live wire, and he was, a really dangerous cat. And he's somebody who, Doug could kind of control mostly. Someone, that he would listen to Doug. And I think that was really the only person who he would listen to because he wanted to keep him, close. Again, like the sense that nothing's ever going to change. We're always going to live in the same house. We'll always do the same things. Really resistant to any sort of future. But that devotion and that love comes out in these violent, semi-psychotic ways, where he's really trying to hang on to something, to hang on to the past that's already moved along. He's I mean, I think he's a real tragic character, scary character, but really tragic. And I love the way he goes out in the movie. It's a little different from the book, but note perfect. I knew I had to stay away from like the Whitey Bulger of it all. That's Black Mass. That's where everyone goes. But there was this little florist shop right at the bottom of the hill in Charlestown, kind of as you drive in across from Boston, or at least there used to be. And it was this tiny place, and the flowers in the front window were half dead. And I'm like, this is really interesting. There's something going on here. And that got me to thinking about a guy kind of running the town from inside this small flower shop. I knew how it was going to end, or how Doug's story was going to end. Honestly, I'm not sure that I had Fenway Park like locked in for the final heist when I started it, believe it or not. I just knew that it had to be something big. But again, in thinking it through, as I said, a cash business, I'm like, well, that's a really interesting, because it's something everyone from the area would, go to Fenway Park. So to rob it seemed like a really, transgressive thing to do. So yeah, I mean, and I knew that it would go awry, and it was a lot of, fun sort of planning out how those, how the four guys, how their stories would, how they would wind up and how their stories would end. Um, so to answer your question, I always knew, where Doug was going. Again, without wanting to give too much away, I think by the end of the story, he sort of took it upon himself to sort of save or deliver like his town, like Charlestown. Like he goes back to the florist, because everything's kind of fallen apart for him, and he feels like his last act could at least be to try to remove this cancer from his town, and maybe maybe things will get better. I knew that they were shooting the movie, but I hadn't been approached, and I didn't know if I was going to be invited to the set, and I was eventually right at the end, and it was great. But I didn't, I kept reading about it in the newspaper, and I had a friend who worked at Fenway Park for the Red Sox. And he's like, they're shooting here, come on down, you can see it. Great. So I went in, he got me inside. We got up on one of the runways behind the stands, and I'm looking down over the street, and there's a crashed ambulance, and there's a truck there, and there's 100 people there. And that's when it really literally hit me that this story that I cooked up in my bedroom office at home, is now employing 150 people on the streets of Boston, and they're shooting it in Fenway Park. It was really, really, it was really mind blowing and really exciting. But I was literally at home at work, taking a break, kind of checking news, and I saw this headline in Variety that says Affleck moves to the town, and I'm like, the town, and that was it. And they were going to, he was going to make my movie. But he had made Gone Baby Gone, so I knew that the accents were going to be right. That's a big thing regionally here. Every Boston movie, everyone either sounds like a Kennedy or just some total cliche. And so I knew that it was in good hands in that respect. And then once I saw the movie about 2 months before it came out. And again, I'd written the book, then I'd gone away, and then I'd worked on the movie, and then I'd gone away, and now I was seeing the movie. So there were things from the book, there were things from my script, there were things that were new. And it took me about 2 hours of walking around Manhattan after the screening to realize that I think it's a really good movie. Like, I was really excited. And then I just had like a 2-month honeymoon waiting for friends and family to be able to see it. Well, Gangland is the first, time I'd written a crime book on my own in more than 10 years. I mean, again, I was a little gun shy. Writing a novel is like the toughest thing that I'll ever do as a writer. I mean, writing scripts is difficult, no question, but it's also fun, and and there's a collaborative nature to it. Television is completely collaborative. So I was a little reluctant, but my agent was representing someone who was going to tell a nonfiction version of the story of Tony Accardo, who had headed up the outfit in Chicago for so many years. And the story that I hadn't heard was this true life incident of these jewel thieves who had ripped off a jeweler, but they hadn't really cleared it, and they hadn't paid their street tax, and they hadn't sort of fixed it with the outfit. And so Accardo made them give everything back after they had already fenced it. And insanely, out of spite, out of whatever, a couple of them broke into his house, the mafia boss's house, while he was away in Palm Springs for the holidays, to try to get these jewels back. And he found out, came back to Chicago, and started killing every thief in Chicago. Once he killed the thieves that were responsible, he started killing other thieves. And then as people started to realize what was going on, he started killing the killers so it wouldn't come back to him. Just this incredible, almost like Shakespearean story. So there was some talk about maybe doing a script based off of that nonfiction book, but they never actually pursued that book. And in the meantime, I had brought to it, like, I thought that Tony Accardo would make a really interesting main character, but the more I thought about it, he doesn't really change that much. He actually isn't. He's a fascinating character, but to write a book about him, it would be a lot of interior stuff, and I wanted to do something a little meatier. And that's when I really started to think about who he would entrust to oversee these killings, because someone breaking into the mob boss's house, it's a huge I mean, he's lost face. He can't just go to his partners and say, they broke into my house. It's like, it's had to be top secret. So he'd have to go to someone who he wouldn't normally go to. And that's where the character of Nicky Pissarro comes in, as someone who he's sort of worked with before, someone who he can trust and someone who he can kind of control. But as things get out of hand, Nicky realizes that he might be on the hot seat. I really wanted to stick to essentially Tony Accardo's, his timeline. I wanted that sort of true crime aspect to it. At the same time, I had this fictional character of Nicky that he was mine, so I could be as creative as I wanted with him. So it was nice to have a kind of a structure. It's nice to go back to the late '70s disco era, and get out of my quarantine head. That was especially nice. But it was just great to focus on a different city, a different set of a different criminal organization, I guess, than the usual Boston mob, and really dig deep into what that time period was like.